Before I start today's tutorial, I'm happy to announce that I've published a new Skillshare class. In this class, I'll be showing you how to paint icy drinks, but I will break it down in specific techniques to practice step by step, right from the shape of the glass, then how to create the basic colors for the drinks with options, to techniques in creating ice within the drinks, then putting everything together with toppings. These are all painted with a looser style, and with the way I've broken it down, you can mix and match the techniques according to your own levels, so this is suitable for all painters. If you've never been a member on Skillshare, you can go to the link in my description box to get a free trial where you'll get access to all the classes, including mine. And if this sounds like something you might be interested in, I hope to see you there. Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to paint a collection of tropical fruits. I'm going to approach this in a loose style, which isn't usually something I go for when it comes to food illustration, but I ended up loving the process, so let's start by doing the light sketch where I can map out the placement of these fruits. Before I approach this, I already thought about the fruits that I definitely want to include in the composition. I love the idea of an open papaya where you can see the seeds, a pineapple, a pink guava, and mangosteen, one which is closed and one that is open so you can see the inside of the fruit. So those were the fruits that I placed in the middle and I drew out first. Once I've sketched out these main fruits, then I can see the space that I have left, so I can think about the supporting fruits that I can add to the composition to fit the rest of the space and help frame the main fruits in the middle. As you can see, I'm just sketching the rough outline and shapes, but I will paint the details freehand later so I don't get too caught up in the details now. I'm saving time, and this way I can think about the overall composition instead of focusing on every single little feature. I'm also sketching very lightly so I don't apply too much pressure on my papers. This way I don't risk damaging the paper itself. By the way, if you're not into sketching, I'll have this outline available in my coffee shop. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with what I have so far, and I'm quite happy with how the page is filled. Next, I'm going to go over the colors, starting with Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Sepia by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Terre Verte by Holbein, and Indigo by Schmincke. Let's start by painting the base of the pineapple. I'm going to use a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium, Jaune Brilliant Dark, and a little bit of Vermilion. I'm going to use a medium consistency to just paint the whole base, and as I get towards the bottom, I'm going to darken it slightly. Before I reach the bottom, I'm going to mix up a darker color. This is from the same mixture with added vermilion and a little bit of sepia. I felt like the brown was a bit too muted, so I decided to add more vermilion into the mixture. I just dot it in and mix it straight on paper. I'm going to continue upwards by using a light muted yellow-green. This is from a mix of Terre Verte, Hansa Yellow, and a touch of Vermilion. As I get towards the top, I'm going to add more Terre Verte, so the color is a little bit more green and slightly more saturated and bright. I tried to paint on the pointy leaves straight away, but I left out some white negative space, and I also tried to darken the end slightly by adding a slightly thicker consistency of Terre Verte. Going back to the yellow area, I feel like the color has faded too much, so I added more Hansa Yellow. I just dot it in. Then I want to sharpen and add the slightly darker tone of green around the edges of the leaf. Now that the pineapple is really wet, I'm going to leave it to dry and move on to the papaya. Around the edges, I used a mix of Hansa Yellow and Jaune Brilliant Dark in a medium consistency. Then as I get towards the center, I use a mix of Vermilion and Hansa Yellow medium for an orange. I try to create an uneven surface by smudging those two colors together. Then on certain areas, I'm going to darken it with the same mixture, but with more vermilion in the ratio. For the skin, I used Terre, Verte, and Hansa Yellow medium, and I also added a touch of vermilion to mute the color slightly. I'm just using a light consistency, and just like the flesh of the papaya, I like to vary the green by adding some Hansa Yellow here and there. You can see that I didn't wait for the flesh of the papaya to dry. I actually don't mind if the green goes into the flesh slightly, but if it traveled too much, I would take it off with a dry brush. I feel like the area is too wet here, so I ended up taking it off using rolled tissue so I can darken the green of the skin. I just basically added more Terre Verte in the mix, and I'm also using a thicker consistency, placing it in random areas while the surface is still damp. Now I'm going to paint the seeds. You can see that I've left out a bit of white at the center of the papaya. And for the color, I use a mix of sepia and vermilion. I switched to my small brush in order to paint those small outlines of circles. Then once I've covered most of the space, I feel like everything's quite wet, so I'm going to dry it off slightly with a hairdryer. You can see that this is still damp, but the paint won't spread out as much, so I just layer a thicker consistency. I feel like the seeds look a bit too heavy, so I'm going to take off a section with tissue to lighten it and then just neaten some of the edges. I'm going to increase the contrast in value, so here I've mixed up an even darker brown by adding indigo into the mixture. The flesh of the papaya looks kind of pale, so I'm going to increase the saturation. This is from the same mix of vermilion and Hansa Yellow. When I'm placing this, you can see that the base of the flesh is completely dry. You can see hard edges, but that's okay because I can just smudge some of them using a clean damp brush. Now let's go back to the pineapple. This is probably the trickiest part of the painting. I just added a lot of vermilion and yellow ochre to the dark brown mixture from the seeds. Then I'm going to somewhat paint hexagon shapes. I think there are 6 sides. You can see that I'm not very accurate with this, but I was trying somewhat to keep it as uniform as possible. But while doing this, I also want to think about the round form of the pineapple, so the shape gets a little bit squished towards the top and the bottom. Just like the base color, I'm going to darken the bottom. I'm just going to do a light wash under some of the hexagonal shapes, and right at the bottom I just do a full wash. Around the edges, I try to also make it a little bit pointy and uneven, since the center of the hexagon usually have these pointy ends. And with this, I just try to layer little by little, and each time I try to use a slightly darker value. This is from the same mix, but with a slightly different ratio. I usually like to add more sepia or a bit more vermilion into the mixture. If I want the color to be brighter and more saturated, then I would add more vermilion. There are times where certain parts look messy because I am working on a damp surface, and if that's the case, you can just stop the paint flowing everywhere by taking off the excess with tissue. I feel like everything is really wet, so I'm just going to let the paint settle, and meanwhile I'm going to work on the crown of the pineapple. I'm going to outline or try to somewhat figure out the outlines of these leaves, especially the ones in the middle. Then once I'm done, I'm going to use a clean damp brush to smudge the bottom of the leaves to help make them look separate from each other. The form is getting there, but I want to increase the value in between the leaves. So for this, I just use the dark brown that I've already pre-mixed on my palette and paint in between some of those leaves. The body of the pineapple should also be a little bit more dry by now. It's still a bit damp though. As you can see, the edges that I'm painting is blurring out. And I'm just basically going to enhance the texture slowly. Right at the bottom, this area should be in shadow, so I'm going to increase the value and the contrast by mixing yellow ochre and vermilion into the sepia mixture. I feel like I'm fairly happy with the pineapple, so next I'm going to paint the pink guava. I used Jaune Brilliant Dark as the base, then for the pink I added some vermilion and a little bit of Quin Red. So here I'm starting with the Jaune Brilliant Dark, painting the base and also leaving parts where I'm going to paint the seeds. And while the surface is still damp, I'm going to add in a little bit of that pink and I'm going to let the paint bloom naturally. As for the skin, I'm using Terre Verte as the main green with a bit of Hansa yellow and vermilion that I already have on my palette, and I also turn it into a pastel tone by adding Jaune Brilliant Dark. Just like the papaya, if I feel like those two colors are blending too much into each other, I would take off the excess using tissue just to stop the paint from flowing. Then I'm going to slowly build in the value by adding more Terre Verte into the green. I'm also going to slowly build the saturation of the guava by using a slightly thicker consistency of the pink mixture. I want to increase the saturation even further, so I added more Quin Red into the ratio. For the ends of the pineapple here, I added indigo to the Terre Verte. Then after this, I'm going to paint the leaves on the guava. I just used the same mixture as the tip of the pineapple, but I added Jaune Brilliant Dark to turn this into a pastel tone. I like to always vary the colors, so for this next one I added a little bit of Hansa Yellow Medium, so you can see that the color is a little bit more of a yellow-green. While the surface is still damp, I like to add darker tones. This is basically the same green with a bit more indigo in the ratio. For the seeds of the guava, this is a mixture of yellow ochre and vermilion with a bit of sepia. And I'm going to place it in a circular pattern while playing with the size slightly so the seeds don't look uniform to each other. For the vines and the midrib of the leaves, I couldn't be bothered switching to a smaller brush, but it is recommended because it was quite difficult to create very delicate lines. But I just tried to smudge some of these lines to make it look a bit more organic. Next, I'm going to paint the watermelon. I'm going to use the pink mixture from the guava, but here I've added more Hansa yellow and a bit of Jaune Brilliant Dark. I placed it at the bottom and left the top blank because I'm going to follow it up with a thick consistency of vermilion. I tried to spread some of the paint randomly downwards so you can see that it's much lighter and the paint is just somewhat mingling with each other. Then I'm going to build up on the value with a darker red where I've added Quin Red and a bit of indigo in the mix. For the side, I'm going to use a thinner consistency so there's going to be a separation between those two faces. I'm just going to wait for the watermelon to dry now and move on to a different fruit. I'm going to paint the mangosteens. This is my favorite one because I love the vibrancy of the color. This is from a mix of indigo with vermilion and Quin Red. And you can see that I'm going to play with the ratio. On the left, the color is more of a pinkish purple, which has more Quin Red in the mix. And on the right, there's more indigo. For the inside of the rind, I'm going to use the pinkish purple, but for this I'm going to use a thin consistency. It looks a little bit dark, so I ended up taking off the excess with tissue. To separate it with the outer layer, I added more indigo in the mixture, so it looks like more of a deep dark purple. For the green cap on top of the mangosteen, this is from Terre Verte, Hansa Yellow, and a bit of vermilion. The texture of this part is actually very similar to the mangosteen skin, which is why I've left out some white for highlights. I've also added shadows with extra indigo in the mixture, and I'm going to move on to the flesh. For this, I use a similar mixture to the guava. I started with a thick consistency at the center, then I just use a clean damp brush to cover the rest of the area. Around the edges, I've added a thick consistency of that pinkish purple mix, and then I'm going to smudge some of it into the flesh. I think I'm fairly happy with the base, so now I'm just going to increase the saturation as well as the values on contrast on the second layer. After this, I'm going to add the shadows underneath the green parts, and for this I'm just using the same mixture but with added sepia. To separate the little sections of the flesh, I use a medium consistency of indigo, but I feel like those blues stand out too much against the purple, so I'm just going to smudge it with a clean damp brush. Then I'm going to take some of the purple and mix it into the blues and also add more of that pinkish tone as well. Once I'm happy with the color variation and the textures, I'm going to move on to paint the seeds. Here I'm using a thick consistency of sepia to paint over some of the guava seeds, as well as the watermelon seeds. The next fruit will be an opened passion fruit. I use the same color as the mangosteen. I first outline it fairly evenly. Then I'm going to soften the color by taking off the excess and also using a clean damp brush to soften the inside edges while leaving the center dry. On this dry surface, I'm going to then use a medium to thick consistency of Hansa yellow and a bit of vermilion. And taking advantage of the damp edges, I added some vermilion mixed into the purple outside of the seeds and the dark mangosteen purple right along the edge. For the seeds inside of the placenta, I think that's what they're called, I'm going to use a brown mixture from sepia, vermilion, and a bit of Hansa yellow. And I'm going to play with the ratio, so some areas are a bit more orange, whereas others are a bit more brown. Once I'm done, I'm going to dry everything off so I can layer more of a saturated color and darken certain values. Once I'm done with this one, I'm going to move on to the next fruit. This is the sliced star fruit, and I'm using a light consistency mix of Hansa yellow medium and Jaune brilliant dark. While the surface is still damp along the edges, I'm going to add the same mixture with added vermilion and yellow ochre. Then I'm going to soften the blend between those two colors so the center is lighter than the edges. I'm going to line the bottom edges of the star fruit with a thicker consistency of the same color, and this should give it a little bit of thickness. And I'm also going to increase the saturation with a thick consistency of Hansa yellow. I'm going to darken and mute some of the other sides. This is from the same mix with added sepia, and I'm just using a really light consistency. As for the seeds, I'm using the same mixture, but this has more sepia in the ratio. I don't want it to look too dark against the really light flesh though, so I would just take off the excess using tissue. Next, I'm going to paint the citrus fruits. This one will just be a simple kumquat, and I'm using a mix of Hansa yellow medium and vermilion. I just added more vermilion for the more deep orange color along the edges. As for this next one, I'm going to turn it into a calamansi citrus fruit with a deep yellow base. Then I'm going to slowly build up the green on top of the yellow while the surface is still damp. And this is just from the previous green mixture on my palette with added indigo. I want the avocado to look rich and buttery. Where I live, sometimes we get a buttery yellow avocado. So here I'm using the calamansi green with added Hansa yellow and Jaune brilliant dark for the flesh. Then along the edges, I'm going to add a bit more of the calamansi green into the mixture for a darker, more rich green. For the skin, I added even more indigo since I already have a lot of yellow on my palette, and I'm using a thick consistency. Then I'm going to dry everything off before the paint runs into each other. I'm just going to work from the colors that I already have on my palette. For the base of the seeds, I just added yellow ochre to the dark brown. Then I'm going to let this dry and start adding on the details as well as the saturation of the avocado. As I mentioned before, I want the avocado to have this rich buttery color. So here I'm layering on a mix of Jaune brilliant dark, Hansa yellow, and a bit of vermilion. After this, I'm going to smudge the color and dry it off so I can paint the details on the seeds using some sepia. This is optional, but since I want the avocados to look a bit more natural, I added some spots using the dark brown in a really light consistency. For the last fruit, I'm going to use the avocado colors for the pastel green base, and I'm going to adjust the ratio by adding more indigo and Terre Verte in the mix for the darker greens along the ridges of the fruit. I haven't seen this fruit outside of Indonesia, but these are called belimbing wulu. Belimbing means star fruit, so I'm guessing they're in the same family, but these are actually very small and super sour. So we don't eat this as a fruit, but we use this to add acidity to soups, and we also make sambal, or something that kind of looks like a spicy salsa. I'm basically done with all the fruits here, and I'm just going to add the stems and leaves for some of these fruits. Then I'm going to adjust the colors to increase the contrast and details for certain areas until all the colors are nice and balanced. There's a bit of extra space next to the mangosteen and underneath the mangosteen, so I'm just going to fill it with a couple of leaves. I quite like the shape of the leaves from the guava, so I'm just going to add at the same times. Lastly, I'm going to add some colorful dots. I'm just using the colors that I've already used for these fruits. So even though the colors are different, they're going to be consistent with the whole composition. And that's it for this painting. I actually end up really enjoying painting these fruits in a loose style, which is fairly new to me, and I hope you also learned something new along the way. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!